Nobody expected the tension to erupt so suddenly, but everything changed the moment Chuck Norris noticed something off about that dusty old ranch on the outskirts of Helena, Montana. He had arrived in the area for a brief respite, hoping to breathe in fresh country air and escape the clamor of city life. He found himself drawn to rolling plains and quiet landscapes, so when he heard whispers of an elderly rancher named Walter Thornton struggling to keep his ancestral land afloat, he felt a stir of curiosity. Locals described Walter as stoic and reserved, a man who seldom asked for help and never complained about the long hours spent tending his livestock, yet there was an unspoken tension in the way they shook their heads whenever his name came up. Chuck decided to pay him a visit one late afternoon when the sky blazed with gold and orange. He spotted Walter leaning against a weathered wooden fence, gazing over the sweeping pasture that had belonged to his family for generations. Chuck said hello and introduced himself, noticing that Walter's eyes lit up with subdued warmth, as if he was relieved to finally have someone to talk to about his troubles. At first Walter tried brushing him off politely, saying he could manage on his own, but Chuck sensed deeper layers of distress beneath the old man's calm tone. He had learned to trust his instincts, so he stuck around until Walter invited him inside the humble ranch house. The structure bore signs of age, with creaking floorboards and faded wallpaper, yet Chuck felt a comforting presence in that home, as though every wooden beam carried decades of memories. Over mugs of strong coffee, Walter explained how he had fallen behind on payments since a harsh winter caused him to lose half his herd. The banks were breathing down his neck, and rumors circulated that a ruthless developer had been circling like a vulture, determined to seize the ranch for some monstrous commercial project. Walter had tried ignoring the rumors, but strange incidents kept happening, like fences getting cut overnight, or feed deliveries vanishing without explanation. Chuck leaned forward and listened carefully, suspecting that these incidents weren't just bad luck. He asked if Walter suspected anyone in particular, but the old rancher only shrugged, mentioning that he had once confronted a few suspicious men lurking near the property line, only to be told that he needed proof before accusing anyone. Chuck's eyes narrowed as he imagined how easy it would be for a powerful developer to pay a few shady characters to sabotage the ranch until Walter felt pressured to sell. He saw the strain in Walter's posture, the heartbreak of a man who had poured his life into a piece of land that might be snatched away. Chuck remembered times he had witnessed powerful people exploit those who had no resources to fight back, and he felt a deep sense of injustice. He decided he was not going to let Walter become another casualty of greed. He asked Walter for permission to stay at the ranch a few days, insisting that he enjoyed the countryside. Walter agreed, looking uncertain but also hopeful, because Chuck's presence felt like a lifeline. That night Chuck slept in a small guest room with bare walls, but his senses stayed alert. He woke before sunrise to help Walter with the chores, feeding the animals and walking the perimeter to check the fence lines. As they walked, Walter pointed out signs of tampering, footprints where they shouldn't be, broken boards that might have been kicked in. Chuck knelt down to examine a few footprints in the dirt, comparing them to his boot size. They were fresh but didn't match any shoe he recognized. Still, it was enough to prove that someone had trespassed. Walter sighed heavily, explaining he had tried calling the local authorities, but they seemed unenthusiastic. They would send a deputy out to take a quick look and offer vague promises, yet the sabotage continued. Chuck realized that the developer might have sway in local government, especially if big money was involved. He told Walter to hold on a little longer. He said that if the developer wanted to play dirty, they would have to reckon with Chuck Norris first. Walter managed a small smile, though he wondered how much one man could accomplish. Chuck spent the next few days scouting the ranch at different times, walking under the blazing sun, observing vantage points, learning where the vulnerabilities lay. He discovered that the northern corner of the property, near a rocky outcrop, was an easy spot for trespassers to slip in unnoticed. He also noted that the stable had only a single old padlock at night. Chuck let the dust swirl around his boots, deciding he needed proof that a malicious party was behind the sabotage. He asked Walter if he had any cameras. Walter sighed and said he had tried installing a couple of cheap trail cams months ago, but they were smashed or stolen. Chuck frowned, suspecting the saboteurs knew exactly how to dodge or destroy evidence. That evening, Chuck drove into town and visited a local hardware store, buying some discreet yet durable surveillance equipment. The shop owner recognized Chuck from local gossip and asked if he was planning a stakeout. Chuck merely grinned and said he was doing some wildlife observation. He returned to the ranch under the cover of darkness, concealed the equipment in places nobody would suspect, and tested each camera's night vision. Walter watched with gratitude, though he also warned Chuck that he had limited funds to reimburse him for such gadgets. Chuck waved off the apology, stating that justice was more important than money. Late that night, Chuck set up a small watch by the barn, confident that if saboteurs came, he would detect them. Hours passed in silence, the ranch blanketed by starlight and the gentle sounds of horses shuffling in their stalls. Nothing happened, so near dawn he allowed himself a little rest. However, the next day revealed a brazen act of vandalism on the far side of the ranch. Someone had cut the fence again, letting half the cattle wander dangerously close to the highway. Walter was distraught because if any animal caused an accident, the liability could be enormous. Chuck helped gather the herd, working with surprising skill, corralling them back before any real danger struck. He saw fresh tire marks leading away from the fence, evidence that whoever committed the sabotage had driven off quickly. Walter mumbled that he might be forced to sell if these antics continued because he was running out of energy and financial means to keep repairing all this damage. Chuck said he understood the frustration, but he also told Walter not to surrender yet. He hurried to check if any of the hidden cameras had captured footage. As he examined the recordings, he caught a partial glimpse of a large pickup truck parked in the distance near the fence line. The image was grainy, but it offered a starting point. Chuck took careful notes of the truck's shape, color, and possible logo on the side door. He recognized the swirl of a distinctive company emblem but couldn't make out the name. Walter squinted at the screen, trying to remember if he'd seen that truck around town. Chuck decided he needed to head back into Helena to make inquiries, hoping that local folks might know who owned a vehicle like that. Walter asked if he could join, but Chuck insisted he stay and keep an eye on the ranch in case more trouble arose. So Chuck drove into town and visited diners, feed stores, and the local gas station, casually dropping descriptions of the truck. At first, nobody seemed to recognize it. Eventually, a mechanic near the outskirts recalled seeing a pickup with a swirl emblem come in for some repairs a month ago. Chuck pressed for details, but the mechanic only remembered that the driver wore a fancy suit and demanded quick service, flashing a big roll of cash. Chuck thanked him, feeling that tingle of suspicion intensify. A fancy-suited individual using a truck for sabotage sounded like a developer or his hired muscle. Therefore, Chuck decided to approach the Helena Town Hall to see if any large development projects were on the horizon. Indeed, he learned that Redwood Ventures, a significant real estate firm, had been acquiring land around the region, supposedly for a massive resort and commercial complex. People at the town hall mostly shrugged, saying Redwood Ventures had deep pockets and a knack for sealing deals. Chuck asked about the name behind Redwood Ventures. One clerk mentioned a certain Devin Rathmore, a wealthy developer with a rumored history of questionable tactics. Chuck's eyes narrowed. He recalled hearing that name before, tied to controversies in other parts of the country. The clerk admitted Redwood Ventures had been eyeing prime spots near rivers and ranches to create a chain of exclusive resorts. It was a classic story of big money overshadowing local tradition. Chuck realized he might be dealing with a well-connected adversary who wouldn't hesitate to use illegal means if it meant forcing a rancher to sell at a bargain price. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Walter fought off despair, patching up the fence again, worrying about feed expenses, and lamenting the calls from the bank. By the time Chuck returned, Walter looked exhausted. Chuck described what he had learned, confirming that Redwood Ventures likely had its sights on the Thornton Ranch. Walter admitted that his father and grandfather had refused offers from land speculators for decades, determined to preserve their heritage. Now Walter felt guilt for not being able to uphold that legacy. Chuck gripped Walter's shoulder, telling him that a man's legacy shouldn't be sold off by force. He promised that together they would find a way. Late that night, Chuck scoured the new footage from his hidden cameras, hoping to get a clearer shot of the saboteurs. Hours into the recording, he finally got a better angle, the same pickup truck, but this time the door swung open, revealing two men wearing dark clothes. One man made a phone call, though the audio was too faint to pick up distinct words. Chuck paused the footage when the camera caught a partial profile of the man's face. He memorized that face, noting the tough jaw, the scar across the temple. The next morning, Chuck headed back into town under the guise of running errands, but he was really hoping to spot that man or that truck. He visited the local diner, scanning the parking lot. No luck. He stopped by the hardware store again, also no luck. Feeling a hunch, he took a drive toward the nearest Redwood Ventures office. Outside the polished building, he spotted a sleek car with tinted windows and recognized the swirl emblem again, smaller this time, on a business card left on the dashboard. Chuck waited, half concealed by a cluster of bushes, until a tall man in an expensive suit appeared. Chuck's blood pumped faster as he recognized that face from the video. The man climbed into the tinted car and pulled away. Chuck followed from a safe distance, weaving through side streets until the man turned down a road leading to an upscale neighborhood. The car eventually parked near a big house with an iron gate. Chuck took note of the address, deciding not to confront the man there because he needed more evidence first. He returned to the ranch to inform Walter that he suspected Redwood Ventures had an enforcer who orchestrated sabotage, probably under the direct order of Devin Rathmore. Walter's hands trembled a bit as he processed this. Chuck proposed they gather undeniable proof and then confront Redwood Ventures publicly or through the legal system. Walter worried that Redwood Ventures had too much influence, but Chuck insisted that once the truth was exposed, the local community wouldn't stand by and watch an old rancher be robbed. The next few nights, Chuck coordinated a system to catch the saboteurs in the act. He placed hidden sensors around the perimeter, rigged to send a quiet alert if anyone crossed certain points. Walter, though weary, offered to help keep watch. They drank coffee late into the night, leaning by windows, searching for any sign of headlights or silhouettes sneaking across the fields. They overheard coyotes howling, wind rustling through tall grass, but no intruders came. Then, on the third night, just when exhaustion weighed them down, a sensor tripped. Chuck tensed and gestured for Walter to remain silent. He peered outside, seeing faint beams of light moving near the barn. Quietly they crept out the back door, keeping low. They reached a spot behind a stack of hay bales, watching as two figures moved around with flashlights, tampering with something near the electrical box. Chuck guessed they intended to kill the power, probably to cause more chaos or hamper Walter's daily operations. He motioned for Walter to stay put, then slipped around the barn, using the shadows. The men seemed too absorbed in their task to notice Chuck gliding toward them. Suddenly he stepped into the glow of their flashlights, causing both saboteurs to jerk back in surprise. They muttered curses, but Chuck merely told them to back away from the electrical box if they valued their well-being. One man recognized Chuck, the same scarred face from the footage, and realized this wasn't some sleepy old rancher. They hesitated, but the scar-faced man lunged forward, throwing a punch that Chuck dodged smoothly. Chuck answered with a rapid strike that floored the attacker. The second man tried to tackle Chuck from the side, but Chuck shifted his weight, grabbing the attacker's arm and flipping him onto the ground. Walter emerged, clutching a rifle, though it wasn't loaded. He glared at the men, demanding they explain themselves. Chuck seized the scar-faced man's collar, glaring until the man spat out that he was just doing a job. Chuck demanded to know who hired him, but the man refused to snitch. Chuck pressed harder, mentioning Redwood Ventures. The man's defiance wavered, and he muttered that Redwood Ventures didn't have to know about this. Chuck frowned, recognizing that fear of a powerful employer gripped them. Walter wanted to call the police, but Chuck doubted that local authorities would do much without direct evidence tying Redwood Ventures to these thugs. Therefore, Chuck insisted on collecting further proof from their vehicle. He restrained them using old rope from the barn and asked Walter to watch them while he searched. The men's pickup was parked a few hundred yards away, so Chuck jogged out there, shining a flashlight inside the cab. He rummaged through the glove box, discovering a folded contract from Redwood Ventures with blank spaces, possibly intended for forced signatures. He also found an envelope stuffed with money. This alone wasn't conclusive proof that Redwood Ventures orchestrated sabotage, but it strongly hinted at a connection. He also discovered a phone with messages referencing instructions to apply pressure on the old man. That was enough to form a real case. Chuck hurried back, showed the phone to Walter, who looked simultaneously furious and relieved. Walter finally called the sheriff's department, telling them they had caught trespassers red-handed. The deputy who arrived seemed taken aback at first. He recognized Chuck Norris, but also recognized the men who had been working for Redwood Ventures on other properties. The deputy took statements and confiscated the phone and documents, though he hinted that Redwood Ventures had lawyers who might try to bury the evidence. Chuck explained that they intended to go public if necessary. The deputy nodded, looking uneasy. Sure enough, the next day Redwood Ventures attorneys showed up at the local station, trying to discredit the evidence or demand it be sealed for ongoing investigations. Chuck realized the fight wasn't over, so he contacted a friend in local media, someone who cared about small ranching communities. He explained the situation, sharing the phone messages and the footage from his surveillance. The friend smelled the scandal and promised to run a story if Chuck could get more direct involvement from Redwood's top brass. Chuck had a plan. He and Walter decided to challenge Redwood Ventures directly, forcing their hand by letting word spread that Walter was now prepared to file an official complaint and potentially sue for damages. Redwood Ventures, likely worried about negative publicity, arranged a meeting in a fancy office downtown. Walter felt overwhelmed walking into that sleek, modern building, but Chuck walked beside him calmly. They were ushered into a conference room where Devin Rathmore himself waited, flanked by suited lawyers. Rathmore was tall, with a slick smile that didn't reach his eyes. He greeted them politely, pretending ignorance about the sabotage. Walter tried explaining that he would never willingly sell the ranch under these shady circumstances, but Rathmore smirked, implying that if Walter continued resisting, he could lose everything. Chuck interjected, requesting a written guarantee that Redwood Ventures would cease any action against the rancher. Rathmore feigned innocence, acting as though Redwood had no association with the men who broke into the ranch. Chuck calmly placed copies of the phone messages on the table. He then revealed a short clip from the hidden camera showing the saboteurs tampering with the fence. Rathmore's expression froze for a moment before he tried to brush it off as a misunderstanding. Chuck pressed him, stating that Redwood's brand was all over the men's documents. He suggested that if Redwood truly had nothing to hide, it should publicly withdraw from any attempt to acquire Walter's ranch. Rathmore's lawyers stepped in, threatening to sue Chuck and Walter for slander. Chuck leaned forward, locking eyes with Rathmore, explaining that an exposé was already in the works at a local news outlet. He said that if Redwood tried to bury them in legal fees, he would personally go on every platform he had, shining a glaring spotlight on their underhanded tactics. Walter watched, heart pounding, while Rathmore's face paled slightly. The room felt charged with tension, and for a brief moment nobody spoke. Finally, Rathmore's attorneys asked to speak privately with him. Chuck and Walter waited in the hall, ignoring the suspicious glares from Redwood's staff. After several minutes the attorneys emerged, stating that Redwood Ventures would be willing to sign an agreement to leave Walter's ranch alone, provided that the old man refrained from any further legal action. Walter glanced at Chuck, who nodded. They demanded Redwood also compensate for the damages the saboteurs had caused. The lawyers balked, but Chuck remained firm, reminding them that evidence could still be released to the media. Reluctantly, Redwood Ventures agreed to cover repairs for the ranch, pay a settlement for harassment, and sign a document that promised no future acquisition attempts. Walter's hand shook as he signed the final documents. He couldn't believe that a simple rancher could stand up to such a giant if he had the right friend by his side. Chuck didn't gloat or act smug. He merely wanted to ensure Walter's legacy was protected. With the agreement sealed, Redwood Ventures had to back off publicly, though Chuck suspected Rathmore still seethed in private. But any further attempts would now risk a major scandal. The next day, local newspapers ran the headline about sabotage, and the settlement Redwood agreed to. Chuck allowed a few choice quotes, emphasizing the importance of standing up for what's right. Town residents rallied behind Walter, praising Chuck's role. Walter's ranch soon saw an outpouring of support. Neighbors volunteered to help him fix fences, repair damage, and donate supplies. The bank also reconsidered the pressure they placed on Walter once they realized how the sabotage had escalated his debts. They offered restructured terms more favorable to him. Walter walked the land with Chuck, feeling an enormous weight lifted. He thanked Chuck repeatedly, but Chuck said that any decent person would have done the same if they had the chance. Walter shook his head, insisting that not everyone had Chuck's courage and determination. Chuck grinned softly, letting the summer breeze wash over them. The ranch took on a new vitality in the days that followed. Cattle grazed peacefully, the stable was more secure, and Walter felt a renewed bond with his property. He confided in Chuck that some nights he had wept, thinking he was the last Thornton to ever walk this land. Now he believed his grandchildren might someday run the ranch. Chuck was glad to see the tension replaced by hope. Word of their success spread around Helena, and folks joked that Chuck Norris was unstoppable even when facing crooked developers. Chuck brushed off the praise, stating that it was a joint effort. He reminded them that the real victory was seeing a family legacy preserved instead of wiped out by greed. Eventually, the Redwood Ventures scandal quieted down, overshadowed by other news, but the lesson remained clear in the community's memory. Chuck prepared to leave, planning his next journey, though he promised Walter he would return to visit. On his final morning at the ranch, Walter handed him a small token, a leather-bound journal filled with some of his father's and grandfather's notes about ranch life. He wanted Chuck to have it as a reminder of the land he had saved. Chuck accepted it with gratitude. He walked out to his truck, the sun climbing over the hills, illuminating the endless fields of grass. He turned back to see Walter standing by the porch, looking stronger than he had in ages. Chuck gave him a small wave, and Walter raised his hat in farewell. As Chuck drove away, he felt that familiar sense of accomplishment, but also a pang of sadness knowing that ruthless developers like Rathmore existed everywhere, trying to ruin lives for profit. At least in this corner of Montana, an old rancher's dream would survive. Chuck resolved to keep listening for any call for help, anywhere that injustice threatened good people. Walter might be stoic and independent, but even the toughest souls need allies sometimes. Therefore, Chuck Norris left behind a legacy of justice on that ranch, reminding everyone that even when money and power loom large, a determined heart can stand in the way of oppression. He had used his wits, reputation, and unyielding sense of right to ensure that an evil scheme did not tear the old rancher's world apart. If you want more unstoppable Chuck Norris stories filled with grit and heart, remember to subscribe our channel for the next epic adventure.